Hello students. Today in this presentation I'm going to talk to you about one of the social problems that came with expansion of the United States from 1865 to like 1920, but actually it expanded beyond 1920 until like the 1960s. This picture depicted here is of a character named Jim Crow, and it asks you to analyze this picture and list words to describe the character in this cartoon. And I'm going to give you a brief background about this Jim Crow character. And the term Jim Crow became the name for the laws that segregated people according to race in the South and in some parts of the Midwest in the North, but mainly in the South. So Jim Crow was a minstrel character in film and on stage. And Jim Crow was basically a white actor who darkened his skin and put red lipstick on, and he imitated African Americans, particularly African American slaves, African American sharecroppers. So it wasn't a compliment when you saw these minstrel shows. And this character Jim Crow was also based off a song and became the symbol of segregated laws in the South. So take time to analyze and write some descriptive words that come to your mind when you see this character called Jim Crow. So I'm going to give you a rundown of what segregation was, particularly the Jim Crow laws. There's some questions we have on the right hand side. It says, what is racial segregation? How were African Americans discriminated? And how did African Americans respond to discrimination? And I'll give you some definitions of some words. Segregation means you separate people based on race, skin color, religion, nationality, socioeconomic status, socioeconomic class, gender, and religion. And that's what segregation is. Discrimination is where you treat people unfairly because of a characteristic they may have. There can be good discrimination, there can be bad discrimination, but most discrimination is bad. Give me an example that applies to you. Say that I say, all right kids, all of us are going outside to play kickball. If you have a hoodie on, you get to play kickball out on the front lawn of the school. You have a kickball, you have a wide open space to play kickball. But if you don't have a hoodie on, you have to play in the area right next to the school building. You have to play kickball with a football. So that's a form of segregation. So what I'm telling you is that if you don't have a hoodie on, you can only play kickball in the place near the school. And you're going to have disadvantages because, number one, you have a football and you can't play kickball effectively with the football. And if you kick the ball, it's going to go on top of the roof. And I could say, okay, if the ball goes on top of the roof, you can't play kickball again. So I'm treating you unfairly because of the fact that you don't have a hood on. And the kids who have a hood on, they have a wide open space. They have lots of places to roam, and they have kickball. So they have more advantages. So that's what happens under segregation. All right, let me get to the notes and stop talking. It's based upon race. It's directed mostly towards African Americans, but other groups were also segregated. People who were Hispanic, Native American, Asian, and we learned that Native Americans were segregated because they had to live on reservations. But they had to assimilate in order to not be segregated. But that point is already made. Laws to segregate people were called Jim Crow laws, and it was named after the minstrel character in the 1800s. Jim Crow laws socially isolated African Americans and other racial minorities. So what it basically did was it set people away from the dominant group and made them feel left out, not wanted, inferior, less than. So it wasn't good to be segregated if you were a minority. Blacks had unequal opportunities in housing, work, education, and government. And black people and white people couldn't live in the same neighborhood. Banks would turn down African Americans to buy a mortgage for a house, and that's the way it was. Work, black and white people could not work together in the same factory, and if they did, African Americans got paid less. Education, African Americans went to one school called the colored school, and whites went to white schools. And the African American or colored schools had books that are outdated. They had materials that were not up to par. They had weaker facilities. They didn't have it as good as whites, so it was unfair. And government. Yeah, we learned that African Americans could vote, particularly African American men, by the 15th Amendment. But the Jim Crow laws that came into effect after Reconstruction, they did away with that. They undermined that. Undermine means they weakened them. And they imposed stuff called a literacy test, which means that you had to take a test in order to register and vote. And what they did was the white Southern governments during Jim Crow times, they rigged the test and they tricked the African Americans to the point where they would never pass the test. And I'm going to give you an example of a literacy test that was unfair to African Americans. Also discriminate against poor whites, but it was mainly directed towards African Americans to keep them from voting, because many people do not want to see African Americans as citizens, as equal white people. And you had to pay a poll tax in order to vote because of Jim Crow laws. And that, once again, discriminated against African Americans and poor people. It was a way to keep them from voting. You even had the KKK and other hate groups that intimidated African Americans during the Jim Crow era by lynchings, beatings, even murder. And even they would even burn down their house and burn crosses to scare them, to intimidate them, so they wouldn't have the notion of exercising or trying to act like they were free citizens. Another aspect in this PowerPoint is that Native Americans were recognized as citizens in 1924, and that's kind of ironic because they were the first people to inhabit the United States, or before we even was called the United States. And you had two important black leaders who were educators, who had two different points of view, and said that, you know what, we need to respond to this problem of discrimination that happens because of segregation. And their names are Booker T. Washington, who believed that equality could be achieved through vocational education. He accepted social separation. And you had W.B. Du Bois, who believed in full political, civil, and social rights for African Americans. So I'm going to talk more about them later on. Here's an example of some Jim Crow laws. And these are mostly in the South, but you also have some in the North, even in the Midwest. It basically said, in this first law, it shall be unlawful for black people and white people even to play cards together, play dominoes and checkers. And you might think that's crazy, but people felt that that was a bad thing to do for black and white people to play together, even if they were friends. And that was a law in Alabama in 1930, particularly in the town of Birmingham. And another law under Jim Crow said a white prisoner cannot be handcuffed or chained to another black person if they're a prisoner. And you're thinking, if they're both criminals, they're both bad, So they just treated people differently and separate people just because of the color of their skin. And we think that's crazy today, but that's the way it was back then. And that was a law in Arkansas in 1903. And it even said this one from Atlanta, 1926. A black person couldn't cut a white person's hair, and a white person couldn't cut a black person's hair. So I guess they figure that you're gonna get some germs or something. So those are examples of some Jim Crow laws that discriminate against people and separated people because of the color of their skin and race, and it was not fair. This is a picture of a pool, and I want you to think about that when we talk about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, because we talked about the fact that these were two major African American leaders who were educators who wanted to respond to the problem of discrimination created by segregation. And you have a pool here, and when visitors come to a pool and they want to swim, they have two options. They can either dive in, knowing that the pool is real cold, or they can tap their toe to get used to the water and take it slow. So I want you to think about that when we finish talking about the viewpoints of Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois. All right. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.